This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is something quieter than that and more dangerous. What you are watching is not a mistake. It's not confusion. It's not chaos. It is a system discovering that it can keep moving even when the rules underneath it no longer apply. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. No alarms, no emergency vote, just a series of small decisions that all leaned in the same direction. And now we are here, in a place where authority is being exercised without legitimacy, and legitimacy is being treated as optional. If that sounds abstract, stay with me. Because abstraction is how this survives. If you care about how power actually works in this country, not how it's supposed to work, this matters. And it matters right now, because once a system learns it can ignore its own limits, it rarely stops on its own. And the next piece of this story explains who is really in control now, and why that's the part almost no one is talking about. What actually controls a system like this is not elections, not speeches, not even laws, at least not directly. What controls it is enforcement. Who gets to act, who gets to sign, who gets to move forward when someone else says stop. That's the real switch. For a long time, the system depended on a shared assumption that authority only flows from legitimacy, that if a line is crossed, the process corrects itself, quietly, internally. But that assumption is no longer doing the work we think it is, because the system now contains a pressure point, a place where power can keep operating even after its legal foundation is questioned. And instead of retreating, it presses harder. Not to win an argument, not to persuade, but to test something much bigger, whether the system will enforce its own boundaries, or whether those boundaries are just suggestions, waiting to be ignored by someone bold enough to try. That shift changes everything, because once enforcement detaches from legitimacy, accountability becomes optional. And the next part is where you can see that detachment begin, slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly. For a long time, this system worked because it moved slowly. That slowness was a feature. Appointments took time. Authority had to be handed over carefully. Legitimacy was procedural, boring, deliberate. Before, you waited. You confirmed, you certified, and only then did power move. Now, speed has replaced permission. Temporary became routine. Exceptions became habits. Acting stopped meaning short-term and started meaning indefinite. Nothing here looked radical in isolation. Each step was framed as practical, efficient, necessary to keep things running. And that's why it worked, because the most dangerous changes don't announce themselves. They normalize, they settle in, they teach everyone around them to stop asking certain questions. Not because the answers are complicated, but because asking no longer seems to matter. When power keeps functioning after legitimacy is questioned, the lesson spreads fast. It tells the system, proceed anyway. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't stay contained. Because what happens next is not theoretical. It shows up in a single moment where the system should have stopped and didn't. Then the system flinched, not because of outrage, not because of politics, but because one small procedural line was crossed and someone noticed. A question was asked that usually ends things quickly, quietly. The kind of question that assumes the answer will be compliance. Instead, the opposite happened. Rather than stepping back, the system surged forward. Rather than correcting course, it challenged the right of the question to exist at all. The response wasn't defensive. It was aggressive. Authority didn't explain itself. It asserted itself. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The process no longer gets to decide who is allowed to act. That matters more than the individual moment itself. Because this wasn't a breakdown under pressure. It was a choice made with time to reconsider. If you're still watching, pause on that. A system being told it may be operating without legitimacy and choosing escalation instead of repair. That is not a glitch. That is a signal. Because once the system defends the behavior rather than fixing it, the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when this stops being an exception and becomes the rule? Here is where the mechanism becomes visible. This system does not run on consent. It runs on momentum. As long as documents are filed, cases move, signatures appear, the machine keeps going. Legitimacy is supposed to be the fuel, but inertia turns out to work just as well. When a challenge appears, the calculation is simple. Stopping creates exposure, fixing creates precedent. So the safer move is to deny the problem and keep advancing. Who benefits from that? The institution that avoids delay. the leadership that avoids embarrassment, the power structure that treats continuity as success. Who absorbs the damage? The process, the credibility, the people downstream who assume the system in front of them is lawful because it exists. That's the trade. Speed over legitimacy, movement over permission, and once that bargain is struck, it spreads. Because every unresolved violation becomes leverage for the next one. Why slow down if nothing happens when you don't? Why correct if escalation works? That logic doesn't stay hidden for long. It invites replication. And the next moment shows what happens when this mechanism meets resistance. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. Now it speeds up. Questions are no longer answered. They are dismissed. Boundaries are no longer debated. They are challenged. What used to happen behind closed doors happens in filings, in public, at full volume. The posture changes from explanation to confrontation, from compliance to defiance. The system does not pause to check itself. It doubles down. Authority insists it does not need permission. That oversight itself is the problem. That being questioned is an abuse. This is no longer procedural drift. This is acceleration. Because once power learns it can survive open contradiction, it starts to test how far that contradiction can go. What else can be ignored? Who else can be bypassed? Which limits are real and which are decorative? Each unanswered challenge becomes proof of concept. Each escalation becomes precedent without being called one. And here's the dangerous part. The system is no longer trying to win. It's trying to exhaust. And when exhaustion works, the damage doesn't look dramatic. It looks permanent. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because this doesn't land on institutions. It lands on you. It lands when you're told the process is valid because it's already underway. When questioning it is framed as disruption. When delay is treated as danger. It lands when authority asks for your compliance, not your consent. If you're a defendant, the rules are supposed to protect you from exactly this. If you're a citizen, the system is supposed to protect itself on your behalf. But when legitimacy becomes optional, those protections thin out fast. You don't get a notice saying the rules changed. You just feel it. Fewer explanations, less transparency, more insistence that this is how things are done now. If you're still watching, it's because you sensed that shift already, because you felt how quickly temporary becomes permanent. Pay attention to that instinct. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Because what happens next is not about one district or one system. It's about how far this spreads once everyone realizes no one is stopping it. This doesn't stay contained. Systems like this never do. Because once legitimacy is treated as optional in one place, every connected system feels the vibration. Other jurisdictions watch. Other institutions take notes, not on what's legal, but on what's tolerated. When enforcement continues without consequence, the lesson travels faster than any ruling. It crosses borders, it crosses agencies, it crosses assumptions. Suddenly, similar shortcuts look reasonable elsewhere. Similar temporary fixes look efficient. Similar challenges to oversight feel survivable. This is how local erosion becomes systemic risk. Not through coordination, through imitation. Because no system wants to be the only one still following rules that slow it down. No authority wants to be the first to stop when others keep moving. And so the standard quietly shifts. Not by law, by behavior. What was once unthinkable becomes debatable. What was once debatable becomes routine. And now the question isn't whether this spreads. It already has. The question is whether anyone, anywhere, still has the leverage to slow it before it hardens into the new normal. From here, the system has three possible paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, quiet correction. Rules are enforced again, slowly, inconsistently, enough to stabilize appearances, enough to claim the system worked. But adjustment requires something rare, a willingness to reverse momentum, to admit that speed went too far. The second path is erosion. No dramatic collapse, just continued accommodation. Challenges keep coming. They're handled case by case. Nothing breaks outright. Legitimacy fades, but functionality remains. The system still operates. It just does so on thinner ground each time. And then there's rupture. That's when a challenge finally meets resistance that won't bend, when enforcement collides with refusal, when the system has to choose between stopping or forcing its way through. Rupture doesn't announce itself ahead of time. It looks like another routine moment, until suddenly it isn't. Which path emerges depends on something we don't yet know. Whether limits are still real, or whether they only exist until they're tested hard enough. And the final part of this story doesn't resolve that question. It leaves you with it. There's a temptation at moments like this to look for reassurance, for a sign that the system will correct itself, that it always has, that it always will. But that assumption is the very thing being tested, because systems don't fail all at once. They fail when everyone assumes someone else will intervene. What you've just watched unfold is not the end of a story. It's the removal of a constraint. And once a constraint is gone, what matters is not intent, it's opportunity. How often this happens next, how loudly it's challenged, how quickly people stop being surprised. If this feels unfinished, that's because it is. If it feels unresolved, that's because resolution hasn't arrived yet. The warning isn't that collapse is inevitable, it's that normalization is. So don't treat this as a moment that passed. Treat it as a signal you noticed early, because the next phase won't begin with an announcement. It will begin with silence, with routine, with everyone acting as if this is just how things work now. And if you want to understand where that leads, this isn't the last time we'll need to look closely at what the system is quietly teaching itself to accept. Stay with this.